here.
Yes. So, hello everyone. Zoi, are you out there in the internet?
Yes, I'm right here. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you. Hello.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone from Greece. It's raining today.
So, our project is called, or the presentation is called, Analyzing Online Horror Fiction with Corpus Linguistic Techniques for Engaging Museum Labels, which is a mouthful, but basically what we have done is that we have looked for inspiration within horror fiction, and then we have compared and tried to apply that to museum labels in order to create engagement. So the research questions that have guided us through this would basically be the idea of how could language conventions in online horror narratives influence museum labels if we wish for those museum labels to create engagement and immersion in the same way that an online horror narrative could be said to do. And this, of course, is based on the idea that interpretive labels in a museum setting do inform the online visitor experience of an online museum exhibition. Zoi, do you want to do the background?
Yes. Well, the focus of our research was the collections on museums that deal with horror. And recently there is a change and a debate on democratizing museums and having more engagement offered to the visitors and narratives that support pluralism and diversity of voices. Now that opened up the discourse on collective memory, and in the case of difficult heritage, researchers they found out that there is a risk of marginalizing certain interpretations of objects, tangible and intangible cultural heritage, over other representations and interpretations. And there comes the question of labeling and whether tombstone or interpretive labels, they can function as supportive material, interpretive material, which opens up the dialogue to pluralistic narratives, or if it is reconfigured as subjective. And next slide, please, Daniel. Yes. Well, we are arguing that labels in that context are no longer only about sensitive or taboo themes that associate interpretations with traumatic experiences, and we have some examples here. Rather that there is the strategy, the written communication strategy of the museum is a dialectic process. And we were looking into how personal stories they can foster and refrain from othering, and the messages that the labels communicate and share with the visitors, they prompt them to connect unfamiliar objects to themes of familiar experience. And the rationale behind that was to inform the writing, how these labels, they are being designed and put on display, to be informed as the decision-making process by the preferences of the readers and the writers of online horror fiction. With that in mind, aiming to prompt the visitors to come to their own understandings, following their own interpretive pathways, and conversely to avoid or set deliberate provocations when the visitor tours the site.
So the reason why we decided to focus on horror fiction is because horror fiction as an idea can be tied to contemporary fears in society. So horror fiction produced at a certain time period will often contain some idea of contemporary issues or fears within society at that time. Some examples of this that are often brought up would be Frankenstein, with the fear connected to electricity, galvanization, and the rapid medical development at that time, or Dracula's take on sexuality, eroticism, and morality. Furthermore, the multimodality and immersive intent in specifically horror fiction has also been described by Botting in 2003, so therefore it seemed to us like a good text to model our engaging museum labels on. So, onto the method. We collected samples of online horror fiction. Oh, sorry, I clicked on the wrong computer there. We collected the samples using a web scraper, and also through manual link curation, where we included horror stories from an online horror story repository based on their user rating within genre categories. We then, part of speech tag the materials using NLTK and Tagant, both relying on the tree tagger tag set. For this specific study, we decided to focus on nouns in connection to content and location, as well as pronouns, so that we could get an idea about narrator and narrative perspective. Initially, we also looked at verbs and tense. However, both the materials turned out to be very similar in this regard, so therefore we will not be spending time on it today. So, a short note, perhaps especially for those of you who come from Corpus Linguistics, we're working with very, very small corpora here. We're working with what Tognini Bonelli would call special corpora. So what we are looking for is representativity of a specific text type, feature, genre, author, that sort of thing, rather than generalizability that is often the goal of larger text collections. So we are looking at small samples, but we're doing so with a very specific purpose in mind. So for the horror stories are what is colloquially known as creepypastas, which is a portmanteau of creepy things, and copypasta narratives, which is narratives intended to be copied and pasted, basically as chain letters for those of us who remember MSN. We ended up with 150 stories from 43 different genres, and genres you can see in this pie chart here. And as I said previously, we only picked the top-rated stories for each of the categories. We also removed duplicates, but because of course these genres do overlap to some extent. I also wanted to quickly note the geographical distribution of the narrative. So here we have basically run Recogito's named entity recognition and plotted the place names on a map. So you can see that in this regard, data is quite diverse and contains many different locations.
Now, the museum context that we used was the online application of the House of Terror, which is a museum in Hungary, in Budapest, that opened its doors in 2002. With a permanent exhibition on the Hungarian totalitarian dictatorships across 4 floors with 28 rooms, starting from the period under the Nazi rule and the emergence of the Arrow Cross Party, moving on to the taking over the communist rule after the Second World War, and finishing with the revolution of '56 and the Soviet Red Army up to the 1989. The application that's available via Google Play showcases 52 exhibits, and it includes 79 labels. It's fully immersive, it has no cost, and it can be downloaded and used on site as well as off site. And the user interface displays photographs of the rooms, scanned photos in detail, high resolution of the maps, photographs of the scanned objects that are on display, accompanied by labels and text, interpretive text, including direct codes. Now, some of the results that we found in the analysis of the data was that there is a strong preference in the creepy corpus for the I, for the personal pronoun. That indicates that the first person narration is the most prevalent in the dataset, while the third person also occurs quite frequently. It was included due to the rather high frequency of the non-human characters in the categories, such as monsters, ghosts, and other creatures. And U is found as a comparatively high frequency, indicating that there was use beyond that in the dialogues. Whereas in the House of Terror corpus, we looked at frequent words and nouns, mainly collective. They, rather than singular pronouns, was more frequently found, with the emphasis on parties, political parties, and nations, which would also account for the use of it in the singular form, focusing on the actions of those political parties or collectives or groups, rather than on the individual events. And this differs from what was seen in the creepy corpus dataset, where it was mostly commented by you or he. Moving on to the next set of first results, the initial results, are the nouns and the locality. In the Creepypasta dataset, time, room, door, man, and way, they make up for the 5 top frequency nouns. Room provides an idea for an enclosed indoor personal space for the characters within the horror fiction narrative, either as the narrator's room or belonging to another character that is present in the story. And a connotation of this would be childhood, adolescence, or family life, indicating stages of life where accommodation is shared among the roommates and the family members. Now, in the House of Terror corpus, there were territorial descriptions referring to country, state, and campsites and room as well. While camp is seen used both in regards to an army camp, an army landscape, describing labor camps where some of the terror events and atrocities took place, room is found in both descriptions of the environment relating to the story faction of the text within the exhibits as a reference to both space and the film room. Moving on, Daniel.
Okay, so yeah, as Zoi said, the results indicated that for the creepypastas, we're mainly dealing with personal space, we're dealing with home environment, and we're dealing with the first person singular. Moving on to the House of Terror, we still see room, but it's mainly used as a spatial reference to the exhibition itself. So it's not part of any narrative being given, and it remains in connection to the heightened use of it within the data. In general, the results at this point would indicate that the locality and pronoun preferences in the creepy corpus showcase it taking place on a personal level, whereas the House of Terror museum labels operate on a group level. Are we doing on time? It's okay, yeah. So since we're looking at specifically immersion and engagement here, our results align with the previous literature on online horror narratives in that they do make use of full reality in order to create immersion for the reader, and that this would then be reflected from the use of first-person narration or diegetic narration. So, what issues would it create if we decided to try and apply this to museum labels? Well, partially, the perspectives in the narrative are not going to guarantee an impact. And can we even say that immersion and engagement, the way that it's formed in an online horror narrative, would actually relate to the impact of an exhibition? Of course, we would need to test this through some sort of reader response study in order to say for sure. There are, of course, other functions of labeling as well, showcased in the House of Terror museum labels as the use of room in order to navigate a visitor in the spatiality of the exhibition. And then finally, going back to the comment from Bitwood early on in the background, would a museum label with a heavier focus on narration and perhaps specifically diegetic narration compete with the exhibit in a way that is not helpful for the museum experience? The second part of this would be just using the first person perspective in the narrative, right? No, the first person singular, yeah. Because this brings into question the authenticity of the accounts provided through the labels and how to navigate that as a museum curator. It would also need to include some sort of explicit communication to the visitor about the reliability of the narrator, and could also be seen as a return to an authoritative voice within museums as such. Once again, we need to have a look at reader response there in order to be able to say anything. So, further discussion of implementing the first person singular, we do also have to discuss what to think about homogeneity of the narrative account, about the ownership of what's in the exhibition, as well as the pluralism of voices available to the visitor to the exhibition. Finally, returning to what we found regarding time and locality, as I said, we excluded verbs from the discussion here, and what we found was that the diegetic narration and historical description both tend to take place in very similar tense structures here. Also, as previously mentioned, the main common spatial reference room was used to describe the exhibition in the museum labels, whereas in the online horror narratives, it is more a function of the diegetic narrator experiencing these things in their home. Another interesting find about the labels was that they did use you in a quite different way because, well, you can use you to refer to both a singular visitor as well as a group, and in general, as a label device, it seems to function quite well. All in all, we feel that this boils down to a discussion of the narratives that we try to draw inspiration from being often in situ description, something taking place here, whereas the museum labels took place on a group level and were more interested in describing history as something taking place there, you know, something more separate from the visitor. So while we did not arrive at a very clear conclusion, it was a very interesting project to work on and a very interesting way of using the digital methods that we were given under Mariana's tutorship as Valadia.
Yes, we salute to that, for sure.
Okay.